Giving birth is a memory producer. We remember things about pregnancy, sort of general, a few specifics, but boy, giving birth is a memory producer. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about what that translates when we hear birth stories or even see birth videos. It doesn't really tell us what that woman was experiencing or how she feels about it, how she feels about 6 months later, or a year later, or 10 years later. So when birthing better started to develop in the early 1970s, we didn't have any choices in the United States, and there weren't any midwives. We all went to the hospital and just had the standards of care of the day, and we called them medical assessments, monitoring procedures. And because there was an extremely high societal expectation that all of us take the very first childbirth preparation classes, that meant multiple millions of mothers and fathers in the United States from the 60s to the 70s learned skills and used skills in 99.9% hospital births. Listen to that again. Multiple millions of mothers and fathers of my generation used skills to birth our babies. That changed the labor and delivery nurses and the obstetricians and the hospital policies. Instead of not being able to eat and drink, we could. Instead of having to stay in bed, we could get up. Instead of having our what are the other things? We didn't get shaved. We didn't have an enema. We didn't have to lie on the table strapped down with our feet in stirrups. We didn't always have an episiotomy. We could birth in the room we were doing. The reason that the medical profession changed is because of us, my generation. And it didn't get carried forward in the next generation and in your generation. And it got blocked, not because of the labor and delivery nurses in the U.S., not because of the obstetricians in the U.S., not because of my generation in the U.S., but because of the natural birth movement. And I'm going to sound very crabby about it because I've been crabby about it since the 70s. The first natural birth movement in the 50s sided with Lamaze and Bradley and Grantley Dick Reed, that low-risk women, if they learned those skills, would have a natural birth, pain-free labor without medical care. It should have been 100% of pregnant women are going to do the activity of giving birth, and everybody needs to learn skills to do that activity. And that's actually what happened, because Lamaze was taught everywhere. Bradley was husband or father coached childbirth and was paid for private lessons, and definitely more by people who wanted natural birth. However, because Lamaze and Bradley and Grantley Dick Reed put forth a philosophy, that meant the hospitals and the doctors and the labor and delivery nurses were looking to see whether those skills produced the natural birth, pain-free labor with less medical care. And they didn't, which meant that the next group of natural birth advocates, that are the famous ones in the 70s and the 80s, said, see, skills don't work to produce those goals. And as I said before, wrong goal. Goal should have been to reduce suffering, because when women suffer less giving birth, they birth better. That should have been the primary goal, because that was the primary issue in childbirth. The risks were not the primary issue, because there was only a 4.5% cesarean rate in 1970. All women labored. 95% of us labored, whether we had risks or not. And that meant that some of us had good births, good outcome, great births, loved it, didn't feel a lot of pain, thought it was easy peasy, labored for hours. Others labored for days, totally out of control. Babies got stuck. Twins had problems. Breeches had problems. Rh-negative babies had problems because ROGAM wasn't developed until the 1980s. Major abdominal surgery to have a cesarean. And why did that change? Because my generation of women started wearing bikinis, and we didn't want to be left with that scar. So the medical profession responded to us and developed the bikini cut, or the low-lying incision, which then gave us the option to have a vaginal birth after a cesarean. So you need to understand that the hospital is there because modern people are risk averse, and we want them not to, we don't want our births to have risks. We don't want our babies to die. We don't want to die. We don't want to rip through the rectum. We don't want to bleed to death. We don't want to have any of these problems. So the medical profession responds to that. We didn't even want to suffer. So my mother's generation, they knocked all the women out. They gave them scopolamine or general anesthetic. That didn't work well. Women wanted to remember their baby's births. So When we're talking about memories, you were going to tell a birth story. So the birth stories that have been told really since the 1970s or 80s, and I'm going to say split it up because my generation of women and men, we told birth stories about, well, the breathing worked fine, the breathing didn't work fine, I tried to relax, it didn't work well, my husband really helped me, it was really great, we worked together. That's what we talked about. That's how we told our birth stories. If we had a poor outcome, we may or may not have talked about that. But we expected to have the standards of care in the hospital, and when we worked with them, around them, and we felt empowered and we didn't suffer, my generation of women felt fairly good about their births. That started to change in the 80s when the choice-based childbirth trend replaced the skills-based childbirth trend. Women went in with long birth plans and lists of all these things that they wanted because they were now being told by natural birth advocates and famous authors, it's your birth, you know what you want, you should be able to choose what you want, and they should be able to give it to you. And that was always nonsense from the start. You might know what you want for a birth, but there's no way to know what your birth's going to be like. And babies don't come to plan. So if I've talked to tens and thousands of women around the world, I would say maybe a handful of women tell me that the birth was like they thought it was going to be. The rest of us went, nothing like I thought it was going to be. So are birth plans good or bad? We'll talk about that in another lesson. But right now we want to talk about birth stories. So even in the 1980s, what I started to hear were three elements. The first element was a time frame. And when you listen to birth stories, notice these things. My labor started at 3 p.m. My water bag broke at 11. The contractions got painful at 6. I went to the hospital or my midwife came. I had my baby at 11. That's the time frame. Same way for driving to the hospital. We left the hospital early in the morning. We waited all day. I got prepped at 6 p.m. I waited for another thing for time. Right, so this is all about time. The second element is what they didn't do to me. My husband was great, or he was absolutely useless. That midwife or labor and delivery nurse, she was wonderful, or she did this, they didn't like it, blah, 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 she was rude to me, she didn't explain. My doctor was great, or he wasn't, I hated it. So it's what they did or didn't do to me. And the third element is what I felt. I had terrible back labor for hours. My labor was so quick I thought I was going to die. I pushed for 4 hours. My baby got stuck. I was so tight, blah, 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 blah. So it's what I felt. Rarely, as hen's teeth, do you ever hear a woman talk about skills she's used. Now, when you go on YouTube and you see all those beautiful women birthing and all you see is the second stage, and you see her very focused. And the natural birth movement would have you think she's being instinctive, and she would often say that. I instinctively did this. No, you didn't. You intentionally did it. Didn't instinctively do it. You thought it through, and you did it. You thought about your breathing. You paid more attention to your breathing. You relaxed better. You kept your body open. And this is often what we hear from first-time mothers having a second birth. I will use my breathing better. I will relax more. I will not get into labor so quickly. Right? So we have to understand that we need to have skills that you can pass on to your family, and you need to have a societal expectation that it's natural and normal that in your pregnancy you self-learn birth and birth coaching skills. And when you have a son and a daughter, you tell them that when they're pregnant, it's normal and natural for them to learn birth and birth coaching skills and use those skills to birth your baby. Because what we want to do by growing a skilled birthing population, again, is have a fourth element to a birth story. And that's going to be the primary element, which is what I did for myself, what he or she helped me do. I really focused on my breathing. I set up my breathing at the beginning of every contraction. He or she helped me at the peak of my contraction. He or she helped me as I was coming down to relax, to remember to open, to remember to focus around my pelvic clock. He or she reminded me when I was anxious before the cesarean to use my breathing and to breathe with me to calm down, to use the touch relaxation to calm ourselves down. In my birth, because I had done the internal work, I knew in my breech birth that I had created space in my vagina to let my breech baby out, and I couldn't have done it without my partner helping me do the internal work. When we are skilled, we tell a story of our empowerment. That is what we want you to do by taking this course. Now, here's a hint and a caveat. You cannot rub these skills on your body and expect to learn them. You have to practice them. How much do you have to practice? Very little. When you do the body skills, if your body moves open quickly, don't have to practice them at all. You'll remember them, write them down on a little note and take with you. But if your body is stiff, practice until you learn to soften better. If you get the breathing, practice when you're sitting here listening to me. If you understand the positions, go through them in your mind. If you understand the teamwork skills or the communication skills, then do that. The only one you cannot practice doing much of everything else is the internal work, and do it. Your baby's got to come out if you're having a vaginal birth through soft tissue. 99.9% of all cesareans are due to a long first or second stage. And doctors know when women's bodies are tense, it's harder for this big object to get out. And that's what Birthing Better Dads got really clear about. Let's open the body. Now I want to talk a little bit before I let you go on with this lesson about fear in childbirth. It is normal to be anxious and fearful of childbirth. That's built in. We're hardwired to do that. And we're hardwired to do that because fear is a gift when we use it as a gift. It helps us be more observant. And when we are more observant, we can determine the difference between, this is an emergency, I gotta get help right away, and I'm not certain if this is an emergency, I'm gonna really pay attention to this, to I gotta watch this and see whether it gets worse or better. That's what's called the gift of fear. You need to grow that in your pregnancy. You need to grow it in birth. And the reason you're growing it in birth is that after your baby is born, they can't talk to you. So if you have not grown that gift of fear, every time your baby squeaks or moves, you're going to go, what's the matter? As though it's an emergency. Once again, bitch at the natural birth movement. Bitch at the authors. They tell you, don't be afraid of pregnancy and birth. Yes, be anxious. Recognize it. Use it as a gift. Develop your observation. If you feel there is something wrong, seek medical care or do something for yourself. If you feel you need to be observant, observe. It will either get better or it will get worse. If it gets worse, do something or seek medical care. If it gets better, just take a deep breath and go on. There is always a lingering in the back of your mind, the same way it is when we have kids. Right? So if we're being told, don't be afraid in pregnancy and childbirth, it's natural and normal, then we shouldn't be afraid when we have children. Let them run out in the street. Come on, get real. Let them just put that thing in their mouth and swallow it. Get real. We want to develop a gift of fear and to have observations, both for mothers and fathers. So that's my rant for the day. Get stuck into this lesson.